Hello, and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm talking to Reem Gaafar, author of the novel A Mouthful of Salt. This book is a really stunning, powerful story of a community in the north of Sudan struck by calamity and loss. The book opens with a devastating scene of a boy gone missing and presumed to have drowned, and the panic and grief in the wake of his search. Reem explores so much in this novel, including motherhood, the power of education, othering, community structures, tribalism, and so much more. In this episode, we talk about all the themes that Reem writes about and the current war in Sudan, which has, at the time of recording, been going on for over 1 year. The war has led to millions of people being displaced with nowhere to escape the violence, and over 18 million people are experiencing extreme hunger. As a trigger warning, we also talk about some sensitive issues, including FGM, infertility, death, loss of children, and trauma. If you don't feel comfortable hearing about these issues right now, please do consider listening to another episode and perhaps revisiting at a time that's better for you. Reem Gaafar is a writer, physician, and filmmaker. Her writing has appeared in many outlets, including African Arguments, African Feminism, and 500 Word magazine. Her short story, Light of the Desert, was published in I Know Two Sudans, where it was awarded an honourable mention. Her short story, Finding Dakar, was published in Relations, an anthology of African and diaspora voices. A Mouthful of Salt is her debut novel and is winner of the Island Prize 2023. Reem lives in Canada with her husband and 3 sons. Hello, Reem. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. I'm so happy to have you here today. I cannot wait to talk about your debut novel, A Mouthful of Salt. But how are you?
I'm great. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And it's great to be on the show. Thanks.
So your debut novel, A Mouthful of Salt, is one of those books this is quite small. It's not like 100 pages, it's more like 200 and something pages, but it is powerful and it packs a punch. It's a really epic story. Like, we have 2 timelines and we have 3 very powerful women. And before we get into the intricacies of the novel, I want to talk a little bit about your journey to writing it and your journey as a writer in general, because I know that you've done a lot of short story writing, and this is your first novel, which I believe came from a short story, but also actually your professional background is around medicine. You were a physician for a number of years. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about all the things that have led up to this moment.
Well, that's a pretty difficult question because my journey has been just like my writing, very chaotic. This happens in like leaps and bounds. But I can very confidently say that before I was anything in this life, I was a writer because I started writing very early. Before that, I was drawing. And I was good at drawing, but I couldn't really translate what was in my head. I'd always have to copy something from a picture or from something in front of me. But when I found writing, I was 13, maybe even 12. That just clicked immediately because I was able to very easily, I think, just draw this very intricate image on the page with words. And so from that age, it would come in phases. So phases of writing and then phases of not writing. And that's true until this very moment. And it's always been interfered with by schoolwork. And then when I went to medical school, I was writing a lot during medical school because it was a very distressing experience. And then after medical school, I worked as an emergency physician for several years. And then doing my exams, lots and lots of exams, lots of training courses. And then transitioning out of clinical practice into public health, that gave me a little bit of room. And because I was writing a lot for work, that helped me really refine my writing skills. I think that's what gave me a big push. In terms of fiction writing, this is my first complete novel, but it's not my first novel. Unfortunately, I haven't been finishing work as much due to lots of issues. I had two novels that were almost complete. They were complete, but not enough to publish. But they never really ended up going anywhere. What helped me was maybe 2 or 3 episodes where I was recognized as a writer, and I think those were very big pushes for me in life, because you write and you write. Because I haven't had any formal training in writing. I don't work with other writers. It's just me and my medicine and all this other stuff. So when you're recognized for writing, that gives you a big push. The first time was when my short story was published in an anthology, I Know Two Sudans, and it was judged. It was actually a competition that was judged by Leila Bouleila. So it won a place in the book, but it also won an honorable mention. That gave me a big push. And then the second time, I got shortlisted for the Miles Moreland Foundation Scholarship in 2020. And I was competing with published writers, not just any writer. And there were 995 of us competing. And so I made it to a list of, I think, 16 or 17. And that was a big push. I didn't win, but it was enough to give me to go on with. And then based on that, I had another short story published. I was invited to publish my short story, which is also part of a novel, in the anthology Relations, that was edited by Nanekwa Brew Hammond. And she also told me, "You're a good writer." Just those few words were enough to make me take this forward and enter the Island Prize, the competition for the Island Prize. And I didn't think I would win. I didn't think I would get shortlisted even. But that just wanting to be in that competition and to just make it to the long list, to have this feedback that they were promising, gave me the push that I needed to finish this novel. And then it just took off on its own. I lost all control after that.
Wow, that's a really fascinating, like, meandering journey into writing. But what you've said, you've always been a writer. And I'm just really interested in understanding exactly what writing did for you when you were studying medicine or when you were practicing as a physician, because I know that writing is such an outlet for so many people. It can be somewhat therapeutic. It can provide the space and the ability to process. And I always look at doctors in absolute awe, because I think their day-to-day lives are so high, like full of high intensity and so stressful, and you're dealing with traumatic things, pain, suffering, disease, illness, death sometimes too. And so I do wonder, like, how does this person have the space to process that? And I just wondered if you could speak to your experience of maybe how you learnt on writing in that time and what writing did for you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because during medical school, I went to medical school in Sudan. It was the first time I had lived in Sudan as an adult, not a complete adult. I was just 18 at the time. But it was a very new experience for me, because it was the first time I was embedded in this in the country and in the community, in the society. I'd take public transport to class, and then after the fourth year, we start working in public hospitals. It was really the first time I was seeing my people for what they are. There's a lot of I see the good things, of course, but I also see the things that bother me, which is the poverty and the inequities. And it was my first time being exposed to our racism. Honestly, it was very not surprising, because we always knew it was there, but it was just seeing the scale of it and how normal it is. That really, it was a bit confusing for me. I didn't fit in very well, because I was coming from I grew up in different places. I grew up between New Zealand and the Gulf. So coming to Sudan, I was an outsider. And I was also seeing things as an outsider, but as an informed outsider. So I could see that these things were wrong. And that, just seeing all of that, really, I couldn't, the only way I could understand it was to write about it. This is, even until this moment, with my scientific writing, with any kind of writing, I need to write things down. I'm very visual, and then look at them to understand what's going on. I always have lists, pros and cons for everything. So that's what I was doing. I was writing about these things that I was seeing. And then that kind of, it gave my writing a home, to say, because in the past I was writing all this random stuff about stuff that teenagers write about. But when I was grounded in this society, I started writing about things that make sense and things that matter. And I found that through all of my different experiences in different countries and in different contexts, the one place where my writing felt, right, was when I write about Sudan and Sudanese things and Sudanese people and Sudanese challenges, and especially when I write about very normal people, very normal working class people who have daily struggles of just trying to exist. That's really what kind of, I've experimented a lot with everything, but it always comes down to that. So that kind of shaped what I was writing about. And then later on, when I went into clinical practice as an emergency medicine physician, as you mentioned, it's very stressful. to the extent that I couldn't keep up with it in the end. I had to transition into something else, which was public health, which is what I always wanted to do at the beginning. Just all of that experience. My writing was very different during that phase. There were a lot of gory details in my writing just because of what I was seeing as an ER physician. I worked in a very stressful, busy hospital. But when I did transition out of it and I moved back to Sudan, I worked in the Gulf and then I moved back to Sudan, then my writing calmed down a bit and became more of what I was happy with. You do end up absorbing all this stuff from your surroundings and it gets into your writing, but who you are as a writer also influences how you deal with life, I think, at least in my case. And it kind of influences your life decisions. I think it's the same thing that fuels my writing is the same thing that kind of influenced my decision to make this big career shift from a very busy, very high income as an ER physician to move into this very slow pace public health, not that well paying job as a public health physician. And I'm very comfortable with that decision.
Mm-hmm. It was just so interesting listening to you talk about getting insight into Sudan and Sudanese people, but almost as an outsider. And I think a lot of children of immigrants or a lot of people that have moved for whatever reason will understand what that feels like and how loaded that is. But how did you navigate and how did you put down maybe some of the, I don't know, like the preconceived ideas you had or some of the reactions that you were having to certain behaviors, for example, within the community that were really troubling you?
Could you? I don't think I really got that question. Could you say it? Maybe just explain it a bit more.
Yeah. So, like, how did you really, I don't know, find the balance between understanding that you're not from this community or you haven't lived your whole life in this community, and the fact that maybe you've come with some preconceived ideas or just a whole different way of living your life? How did you deal with that, with the fact that actually this was now your lived reality and you were trying to work in this community?
Yeah, I came to a realization at some point during medical school. I went to medical school for 6 years. Medical school is 6 years long in Sudan, and it wasn't even a little longer because there was because of all the politics and the university shut down for several months, and then so I was technically there for almost 7 years. And
Mm.
when I started and when I left, I was a different person, but not that different. I realized halfway through that I wasn't really going to fit in, and I didn't have to. There were some things in my life which they made sense to me, the way I saw things, the way that I saw that things were right and wrong, and I didn't have just because everyone else was doing it or just because it was normal. It's just because we came from different backgrounds. When you're homegrown in a community where something is normal, I come from a very typical Sudanese family, but just we have maybe a different way of doing things. I come from an educated family, and also just because of the international experience and all that. But I distinctly remember, and I only just remember this with your question, but I do remember that at some point, I think it was in my fourth or fifth year, I said to myself that I don't have to change. This is what I believe in, and that doesn't have to change. And this is something that has stuck with me until this moment. I've been in very different environments and very different networks of people, and I don't find myself fitting in most of them. I think that's okay. I came to this realization that it's okay to be a bit different very late in life after a lot of distress because you want to fit in and you want to be saying the same things that other people think and you want to have a normal. I know very few people who change their career halfway through. I know very few people who um, have tried to balance a professional life with something like writing or drawing, except for my dad, who's also a professor, but he paints. Just having that realization that you're not like the typical person, and that's fine. Just having that understanding made me feel a lot better. And it also made me realize that you can be all of these things. You don't have to choose to be one thing or the other. So I think just coming to that realization, maybe at a later point in life and after a lot of distress of trying to do it else otherwise, was when I realized that it's okay to be this way.
Yeah, I think, you know what? I think that's so beautiful because I think so many of us are constantly trying to change ourselves. We're trying to shrink ourselves or grow ourselves or come across differently or whatever it is. We're constantly trying to adapt and fit in, as you said, and feel like we belong and be accepted wherever it is that we are. But as you said, we don't have to change who we are. We don't have to change ourselves. It's okay that we are different. And I think it's important that we embrace really who we are. Otherwise, you're just constantly in this like state of imposter syndrome because you don't know who you are and how to behave. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to start to talk a little bit about A Mouthful of Salt now, which is, as I've said, like it's just a really stunning, like you write very beautifully, very poetically, and like it really, I think, transports the reader to Sudan. If you could just take a moment to introduce your novel and tell our listeners what it's about.
So, A Mouthful of Salt it was, as you mentioned, it was a short story to start with. It came from an idea. All my writing comes from ideas, or it comes from a picture in my head that is from an idea. And I started writing about that picture or that idea, and then it just gets bigger. So this was based on a story that I heard a friend of mine told us about her relative who had to go away somewhere, and she left her very young son with her in-laws. He was only 3 years old, and he was playing in front of the house, and then he was hit by a car and he died. And so she had to come home to that. And then everyone was crying, and she was crying, and her mother-in-law was telling her, "Please forgive me because you gave me something very precious to keep safe for you, and I didn't keep it safe for you." That was a very touching story. I was very upset about it, even before I had kids. But even now, when I have kids, I understand how difficult that must have been. So the idea was always about a child who dies when his parents are away. And then, because I'm from the northern state, and we live near the river, or my family, I've never lived there. I've only visited. Our families are near the river. The most common way for people to die there is by drowning. Drowning is very common in where we come from. Actually, it's common all over Sudan, but especially, I had already had this idea about this, something to do with the drowning and the village and everything. And that's where the story started. It was initially a short story. It was about the child who drowns. People are looking for him, and then it just a few things happen, and then they find him at the end of the story. But then it started getting bigger because I think there were all these ideas that I had about how we deal with the other, and the other in the story was the old woman, how we fear the other, and how we're always finding excuses to blame the other for whatever is happening or to not deal with this other as an equal. And then there was Fatima, who's one of the characters in the story. She was someone that I've had in my mind for a long time. Her character was based on a true story as well of a young girl who wanted to go to have an education, but the society she lives in doesn't accept that. But her father stands by her side, and eventually she does, and she becomes a doctor. And so she wandered into this story as an observer, but then she had a much more active role. All my writing is quite organic; it just happens as I'm writing. I don't really plan anything. There was just that core idea. So the story is that there's a boy who drowns, and there's this village, and they're looking for the boy. Fatma's observing all of this, and then quite a few incidents happen while they're searching. They lose their animals, and then their date gardens they catch fire, and then there's this person that they all fear, who's this old woman who they say wanders the streets at night, like some kind of sorcerer, and she curses people into drowning. Which is a story that people have made up, obviously, but which they so want to believe just because they need to put someone as a villain. So we just follow that story, Fatma's journey, and then we understand the reality behind this woman, and then how everyone's past and future kind of intertwine in the end, and until the end of the story. I'm trying to talk about it without spoiling it for people who haven't read it.
The intertwining, oh my gosh, the intertwining element of the story. It really, I didn't see it coming. It really took me by surprise. And I think it was so good the way that it just crept up on you. But yeah, it was very powerful. And I really generally enjoy stories with two timelines because I think it enriches the story so much to give you all that background information. And obviously, as you said, like the story starts with the scene of this boy has gone missing, presume that he's drowned. And I think that your exploration of that was so moving. I was really hoping that there was he was like lying in a ditch somewhere and he'd lost his memory or something. Like I was hoping that it was going to be a different story just because you really, you write so powerfully about grief. But what we see with his mother, as you mentioned, on the story that it was based on was the parents had gone out of town, and we have a similar story in A Mouthful of Salt. And so there's also this guilt and almost this shame, and there's this really powerful part of the book where his mother is like going through in her head like different scenarios, like if I hadn't gone, or if I had taken him with me, or if I had all these sorts of things, the different sort of realities that could have happened. And also what we see in the book is that this child is his mother's only child. And so you write with a real tenderness about motherhood. What were you most interested to explore about the status of a woman when it comes to motherhood, but also about the mother and child relationship?
I think my life in particular was something before I had kids and something completely different after I had kids. I have three
Hmm.
boys. I have twin boys, and I have a youngest. My youngest one is my youngest son as well. And ever since I had my twins, before I had kids, I was a very active person. I was always on time. I did a lot of work, and I never missed a deadline. And I had great communication skills with everyone. And then after I had kids, I've turned into a completely different person. I'm always late for stuff. It's very difficult for me to complete things on time. I'm always stressed about everything. I feel like my life has gone completely out of control. But that's not just because I have terrible time management skills, but also because as a parent, and I'm guessing a lot of parents are like this, you are just continuously consumed with worry and
Mm.
am I doing the right thing? Personally, I think I'm terrible at parenting. There's always, once this lady told me, when you have kids, you'll understand what it's like to leave the house, but leave your heart at home. And that's exactly what it is. And when my kids aren't there, I'm always like, right now they're in school and I'm just worried about, are they having a good day? Are they having a bad day? Is the teacher being mean to them? Something like that. So the whole experience of motherhood has been honestly, it's been quite confusing. And it's been just this constant worry. If I can explain it in a way, it's just about continuously worrying about everything to do with your kids. So just to like thinking about this, but thinking about losing a child, for me, I can't really think about it as myself, so I think about it as other people. I don't know how I don't know how people go through that, and I don't know how they get over it, if they ever get over it. I don't think they do ever get over it. It's just thinking about how important your children are to your own existence, and then suddenly they're not being there. I try not to think about it at all. So even writing about it is difficult. I just understand that part where when something happens, you left something out and then one of the kids fell over it or something like that. You're always rethinking, if I had just moved it, or if I had just pulled the plug before the iron was too hot, or it doesn't stop. So just imagine if if you might think that you had a role, um, or you could have made a decision that would have prevented your child from getting lost or from anything. So it's I don't know if any of that makes sense. It's just very difficult for me to process how someone would be in the
Mm.
situation. So I try and talk about it, but not actually talk about it.
Yeah. And what we also see is struggles with infertility and having children, which is something that, like from my own lived experiences, I'm very much interested in. And I'm interested in seeing how we're talking about what an issue this is in our communities, how the status of becoming a mother, and I think especially a mother of boys in certain parts of the world, probably all parts of the world, to be honest, seems to elevate a woman in society and in communities. But not just that, but the inner turmoil that women go through when they really want a family and it's not happening, and then the pressures from in-laws or family, whatever it may be. When it comes to that sort of things, what were you most interested in exploring? Because you cover a lot in this like very small novel, but that is definitely one of the things. So what were you really interested in bringing out?
Again, there was no preset outline for this, but in our community, like many other communities in the region, women in particular they have a place which they are supposed to be in. They need to be married.
Mm.
They need to be a mother. That's about the end of it. And then other stuff comes according to where you live. But at the core of it, that's really it. So not being married, for one thing, is an issue. And then being married but not having children is a whole other issue. It's always the woman's
Mm.
fault. And I'm talking about like 90% of the population, not the 10% who are educated and understand that both men and women have a role in infertility or that kind of thing. I'm talking about the vast majority of people who, even if they might be educated, still still always blame the woman for this. It's her fault. And I've seen this countless times. I remember a friend of mine ended up getting a divorce because of this, and there was nothing wrong with her. Just they didn't want to wait. This is very common, this whole thing, or because taking a second wife is allowed. That's what usually happens. Very rarely do you find people who are understanding. And in fact, when you do hear about a couple who couldn't conceive but they stayed together and the husband didn't take a second wife, it's always spoken about with awe. I mean, wow, she didn't
Yeah.
have kids, but he stayed with her. I was in, that's like such a great person, such a great thing of him, even though it might as well be his fault to have children. So that's a very sad reality, which is not confined at all to Sudan. It's in many areas, even in developed countries, to be honest. And also the issue of who the children belong to. This is something that really bothers me. I spoke about it in another novel, actually, the short story that we published in Relations. In Sudan, we have this thing where if a couple have children and they get divorced, it doesn't happen as much now, but it was very common before. So the children belong to their dad. So if they do get divorced, the mother leaves, the kids stay, even if they're very young. And especially after being a mother myself, I cannot understand how people would do that. How would someone take my children? They're my children. There's actually it's actually part of the law here in Sudan, the personal law of 1993, that men are allowed to take the kids away from their mothers, even if they don't have custody. So it's very, and what bothers me the most is that it's the women who champion this. This was actually once a discussion that happened in front of me. This lady, we were at this, I think it was a beauty parlor or something, and she was saying, we just have one child left to get. I was like, what? She's like, yeah, just the youngest one is still with his mom, but his dad's going to, my brother is going to go and get him now. Get him from where? They
Wow.
got divorced and he already has the kids, but he's just waiting for this one, I think, to get a bit older or something, and then he's going to get her. And I'm like, I said, because they're his kids. He can't stay with their mom. And she, the person who's talking, is a mother and a grandmother, and she's an aunt. And I couldn't understand the logic. And I understand this used to happen all the time before.
Mm.
But why are people still doing that now? Again, with this character in the story, the boy's mother, if her son had still lived, hadn't drowned, but they ended up getting divorced because she couldn't have another child, they would have taken her child from her. Just there's a lot going on there, which is based on very
Mm.
sad realities that our community or our society lives.
Mm. Absolutely. It's really shocking, and I think maybe what is the most difficult to hear about these systems, and I think the same applies to the practice of FGM, um, is that it's women that are somewhat upholding it or allowing it to continue in the way, because it's not actually the especially with FGM, it's not the men that are even doing it or perhaps even insisting it on some level. It is women. And I think that just shows you or shows us like how deep rooted these violent patriarchal structures are for women to not think about a world or a reality where this doesn't have to happen, this very awful thing that is robbing women so many times of sometimes even their lives, that it doesn't have to happen. And I think it just shows exactly how deep rooted and how violent these patriarchal structures are. And it's really, yeah, it's very difficult, I think, to think about the fact that women are involved. Yeah, just really hard.
And especially when it comes to FGM, it's as you mentioned, it's the women who insist that it continues, even though they're the ones who suffer. Have been. I mean, you suffer from this at every single stage of your life. It never goes away. So I don't understand
Yeah.
how you can inflict that and insist on inflicting it on other people because of some notion of purity, or I think it's just to manage their God-given right to do this to other people. I don't understand. It's very upsetting.
Yeah, absolutely. In your novel, you show us this sort of contrast between North and South Sudan. And yeah, I found it really really interesting, because obviously almost like the pace of the novel changed, the physical location, the geography, the people, even like the language, like there was so much difference. What were you most interested in bringing out about the difference in these two places? And did you have to do any research to, yeah, just to make sure that your depictions of the two different areas of Sudan were correct?
Yes. What I was most interested in was, and that's where the idea came from, was to show the South Sudanese character for what they really are in terms of that they because in the North they're depicted as just this other person who is just this evil, massive, whatever. when in fact they are a person who used to be a daughter, who was a wife. They lived in a house, they went to school, they were educated, they had a job, they faced challenges, they overcame these challenges, and then they faced more challenges which they tried to overcome, but they couldn't because the society was too strong. It was very important for me to show, and this is something which I think would have, this solves a lot of problems when this other person who you're always fighting against, when you see them, where they come from and what they are, you understand, just understanding where people are coming from, that I think would minimize the friction a lot. That was what I wanted to really show for this character, and also to give a sort of background to the context or part of the problems between North and South Sudan, because there are very deep roots to this. It's not just about one or two things.
Yeah.
And it's not just about what happened during colonial times or what happened during independence, it's all of these things. So just also trying to trace back a little of where these problems were coming from. So that was one thing. In terms of research, I did a lot of research. I always research, even when I'm writing fiction, I do my research. So it's a habit of mine. But also because I was writing about South Sudan, I wanted to be, completely sure that I was doing it the right way. I put it off for as long as I could, but in the end, I had to do it. And then I just sit down and did it. And it was quite difficult because just the lack of resources. And also, almost all of these resources, or actually all of them, were written by British scholars who I think either lived at the time or knew people who lived there. I don't know. Comparing a lot of them, when I was researching, for example, wedding rituals, I look at several different papers and they're mostly the same. So there is some reliability there. Just minor differences, maybe just the areas that they were in or the tribes that they are talking about. But still, just the fact that it's coming from outsiders, even though they're ethnic, they are, what do they call it? Not ethnic studies. They're qualitative studies, which I don't know what the methodologies. Not all of them explain the methodologies, but they're obviously that terrible. But still, the fact that they're coming from outsiders, it was very difficult to find something from the South Sudanese perspective. And I went to a South Sudanese medical school. It was in the north at the time, but it was still South Sudanese. And I spoke with some South Sudanese friends, and I was sure to speak with people who are from the Shilluk tribe, because that's where my character comes from, because their tribes are very different as well. But even getting that information, because most of the people my age grew up in North Sudan, they didn't grow up in the South because of the war. So they'd have to speak with relatives, and it was quite, we just tried to triangulate as much as we could. And then when we had the proof copy, I asked that a South Sudanese person read it. I asked a couple of people, and then we ended up, I really wanted Dr. Francis Deng, who is a well-known scholar and politician, and he's a writer as well, because he was present at the time of all these things that we were writing about. He was there in person during independence, and he had an active role in those. So I waited for his feedback, and he gave me some really nice feedback, and that made me feel that, okay, this is, not everyone might like it, but at least it has some credibility there. So it's pretty tough. I still worry quite a bit about what people from both Sudan and South Sudan might think when they read it. I hope no one gets offended. But I did give it as much as I could.
Just to get everything, all the details, and just make sure that everything was right. And I guess as well, there isn't not going to be a universal experience anyway. I really appreciate everything that you went to make sure that at least what you were doing was accurate and factually correct and not harmful, because I think that's the other thing we always need to be conscious of. But Sudan has had, I don't know, like decades of conflict and war and civil war and violence, and the last year in particular has seen a genocide take place, a war that has led to almost like 20 million people now basically starving and mass displacement. How has what's been going on in Sudan most recently, how has that impacted your writing? And how has that impacted the stories that you want to tell and what you really want to bring out about Sudan?
This war it's really impacted everything. The waking moment of our lives is now just about this. Even with this book, I'm really happy that I won the Island Prize and that I got published and the book is being read and everything, but I can't feel that happiness, honestly. It's just when I make an announcement about the book, I'm like, oh, look at my book came out. It's that way to make these announcements. I open whatever Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and then I have to scroll through posts of people looking for missing loved ones, of posts of people who died and this place has been bombed. It's just, and then I close it. I don't post anything. So it's a big struggle. And also, it's been a struggle to celebrate this book alongside everything that's happening. not just to share the celebration, not just to feel happy about it, but even though a lot of people are telling me we need this kind of good news at this time. This is actually, we're happy to hear about this, but it's still difficult for me to. It's like I'm in a different world compared to what's happening back home. What I have been doing is that I've been using everything and anything about this book and everything that's coming out to try and advocate and just spread the word and raise awareness about what's happening in Sudan. I feel like that's not the right thing to do. It's like I'm using this incident to promote my book, whereas it's the opposite. I'm trying, every time I talk about the book, I try and bring up something about Sudan. I'm trying to use my platform as a published author now to do that to whoever is following me. Even on, strangely, I'm doing a lot of this on LinkedIn, even though that's not the place I should be doing it. But just it's become inseparable. As I said, this war has just taken over our lives. Everything we do is either to try and come to terms with what's happening, or to tell people about what's happening, or to try and find a solution, which we're not able to find. And this book has become, just publishing this book has really become an integral part of that. Yeah, and also one thing that was bothering me was that the book touches on a lot of negative things that exist in our society. And I was wondering, obviously the book was published, it was written before this happened. But I think if it had happened, if the war had happened first, I probably wouldn't have written about these things, just because I didn't want my people at their most vulnerable point to also be exposed in this kind of a way. There are a lot of good things about the Sudanese community, especially during this war. A lot of heroic actions, a lot of people just selflessly giving, a lot of people just trying to survive, and they don't really need this kind of negativity right now. But on the other hand, it's something that we need to talk about, because one of the main problems, one of the main things that led to this war, not the main thing, but one of the things that fed into it, were all these problems that we have as a society. And in order to break that cycle and try and move on, move forward, we need to come to terms with these things, and we need to openly, I think, discuss them and to move on from them. They shouldn't be carried forward. We can't have stuff that's been happening in the early century to still be happening today. That doesn't make sense. It needs to stay in the past, and we need to move on. So I'm hoping that moving through this war, and hopefully as soon as possible getting over it, that we leave all of this stuff behind with this and move forward as a better people.
I really hear you in the sense that when where you're from or any place that is already suffering so much, you don't want to add to that by talking about something negative that's going on. But I think in general, you're right. Like, it's still important to talk about things that are negative or harmful or bad, in one for a better word, because I remember speaking quite a while ago now to Christy Lefteri, who said something that has stayed with me. She said we should think about places as we think about people, in the sense that if you love somebody and they're doing something wrong, you're going to tell them, or you're going to bring attention to it because you love them and you want to help them and you want to help them to be better, and you don't want them to hurt other people, and you don't want to break intergenerational cycles. And it's the same, that we talk about harmful parts of our community or society the world over because we want it to stop, because we love this place and we love this community and we love who we are because of this place. But it is difficult to find that line, I think, especially at a time when there is so much going on. And I think what is particularly true of Sudan is that Sudan hasn't had the immediate attention that it deserves. People generally don't really know what's going on. A lot of people will know that something is going on, but won't know what's going on. And not only, I don't think we need to know necessarily the intricacies of this group and this government, and I don't think we necessarily need to know that, but what we do need to know is the human toll of what's happening. And we are dealing with a crisis that is so massive at the moment. We're talking of millions, tens of millions of people that are basically have nowhere to go and are like losing their lives every day and are starving. And I think that's I think it speaks volumes about the world, the fact that people don't know about this. But I wondered if you could talk about the fact, just the sheer fact, that people don't know what's going on in Sudan.
It's not just that they don't know, it's that they're not even interested. That's what bothers me the most. And this is not it's not new, and it's not a surprise, but still having it constantly pushed in your face. You're trying to keep it's like you're holding this little sign and we're here and this is happening to us. And please, can you care about this? And you're doing that all the time. Um, and even when people do talk about it, they insist on reducing it till this is just a civil war. People are black people fighting with each other or something, or it's Arab versus African, or it's whatever government versus. They're always trying to reduce it to something. I remember I wrote about this was on my LinkedIn page, and the United States had announced that they were finally creating a special envoy to Sudan. And I was like, finally, yeah, because you need to clean up your mess because they had a major role in where we got to today. And then this lady comes and comments, and she's, "Oh, you think that the West was going to solve your problem? This is typical way of thinking that the West is going to solve all these problems for you." And it was just so insulting. I grew up in my mind, like I said, like a 3 long article length posts. No one cared. Everyone was like cheering her on because, yeah, that's what we are. We're just a room full of brats who are fighting, and we're just waiting for the white person to come and save us. That's what people think about it when they do give it the time of day. And so it's very insulting. It's very hurtful. And then when people do choose to cover this, like for example here in Canada, I think maybe they've mentioned it in the news like 3 times in the last year or something. And then when they do bring it on the news, I had an interview with Global News, and then we were waiting when it aired. The whole piece was exactly, I think, 3 minutes long, and it was just like Sudan, and then it was over. And it was like it had no point. It was just like, let's just cover something about Sudan, and that's it. Just the level of disregard that people have for this and we don't know what to do with that. How do you force people to care about your cause? Is that because people don't care and because there's so little international concern for this? That's why this war has been going on for so long. Both sides and all people funding these sides have grown so comfortable in that they can get away with everything, and that's exactly what's happening. It's just getting so much worse. How can you fund a year of this level, a war of this level for an entire year? I mean, where do these you have the Janjaweed fighters, the RSF, and they are traveling all over the country. And Sudan is a huge country, and they are traveling with thousands and thousands of pickup trucks and heavy ammunition. And they're gunning people down in villages, and they're raping people, and they're forcefully disappearing people, and they're doing all of this. Where do they get the money for all of that? How can they go on for this long? And how come their numbers? How are they paying all these fighters who are joining them from all different places? How is this happening? It's because no one is interested, and no one's even when they do talk about it, they're like, "Oh, you just stop doing that," and then they move on with their lives. And this has a very heavy and measurable toll on everything because of this complete disregard. If this had stopped right from the beginning, we wouldn't have gotten to this place.
Yes.
Sorry, when the war comes up, I just go crazy about it.
Of course, it's completely understandable. I think it's one of those things where you're just, and I find myself in awe in the sense that, like, how is this happening and why are we not like screaming? Like, our throats should be dry from collectively everybody. And I don't just mean like certain groups. We should be just screaming at the top of our lungs as to how this is being allowed to happen in 2024, no less, but just ever there's something of this scale is allowed to happen. And I just like Reem, obviously I know you are so deeply connected to Sudan. I don't know like your personal experiences right now, but I hope you know that I am deeply sorry for everything that you're having to go through on a daily basis, and also this sense that you have that you are constantly being gaslit and ignored. Like, I just can't. Yeah, I don't really have enough words right now. But yeah, it's just devastating, absolutely devastating. But I wondered if we could just go back and just talk a little bit more about your book before we have to finish, because I know we've already been talking for a while. I'm really fascinated with the fact that Fatima is really striving to move out of this village, and she really wants education, and she really wants a future. And you mentioned already that was inspired by a true story that somebody that you know of. But what were you really hoping to bring out about education, because one of the things actually that I really enjoyed reading was the difference between the city and the village, and how it does feel like, I think one of the characters said it feels like when you leave the city, you're going back in time. And that's an experience that I have, like when I go to Pakistan, like the difference, but you genuinely feel like you are going back maybe like a decade or even 2 decades. So what were you really hoping to, I don't know, to inspire or to bring out about education and with Fatima's story?
It was a bit tricky to write about this because we're trying to write about it in a way that doesn't give the impression that you think that the village or tradition and living in a conservative society, that's necessarily a bad thing. It's not that
Yeah.
you want to break loose of everything, because that's what our communities, a lot of them think. Once a girl has an education and she goes out there, then she'll disregard her job and she'll start prancing around in the street or whatever. All these pretty weird ideas, which is not, it doesn't always, it doesn't have to happen that way. Education is really a key for people to move for people to break that cycle of poverty and primitiveness. And that doesn't mean that you break away from who you are as a Sudanese, as a Muslim, as a woman. You can have all of those things, but having education is, Fatima were to go ahead and have this education and go and train as a doctor, for example, and then she would come back and then they would have a doctor in their village who was a woman who would save their lives and help when they don't have to travel outside. Or if she becomes a teacher, she would come back and teach, even if she didn't have to come back to that particular place. If she became a politician, she would be their voice outside. It's always a good thing. And it worries me that we still have to explain this in 2024. You would be shocked that whatever Fatima is going through and whatever this village is going through could very easily be happening right now in Sudan, and not even in some remote village. It could be happening just a couple of kilometers outside of Khartoum. That's how little we have moved forward in these past years, because of course the regime that we were under for the past 30 years and their constant deliberate targeting of education and of women's rights, and all of that. So this is really where we are right now. But I think the point that I was trying to make was that education is something that it is not to be feared. It's actually to be sought, especially for these communities who are so closed off and who are so far behind and who are struggling just for their daily lives, and especially for women. And this is something that we know in public health in general. Girls' education is something that breaks the cycle of malnutrition, of stunting, of childhood illnesses, of death, of everything. It just makes sense for people to educate their daughters, and it's not something that we shouldn't even debating that if it's a good thing or a bad thing right now, because we've really supposed to have moved beyond that.
Yeah. I work in the international development space, and so the education, and especially girls' education, is something that I absolutely love working on. I'm always so fascinated by it because, as you said, it it saves lives, it changes future generations, and it helps tackle some other issues as well when it comes to like early and child marriage, for example. But the thing is, like, early and child marriage is an issue in itself, but then the things that it then causes with malnutrition of children, malnutrition of mothers, of difficulty in childbirth, in maternal mortality, and infant and child mortality. It's just, it feels like it's never ending. But education can, because it can just really change the course of that. I find it so powerful. And you said there are still a lot of places around the world. And I think even in the West, sometimes there is this idea that like education or like becoming highly educated is still somewhat vilified by certain groups and in certain places, and you are othered in certain communities if you want an education as opposed to other things, which is just I think it's a reminder that this isn't something that is specific to Sudan or the region or like South Asia even, for example. It's something I think we all need to just pay a little bit more attention to and understand the power of. And speaking about power, you obviously, the village that you write about is located very close to the River Nile. Now, the River Nile in the book for me is like a character in and of itself. And I think even when like Leila Abu Leila writes about it, like there's also the same sort of feel that you get that the Nile is a character in and of itself. And I think because it is so vast, I've never I've not had the pleasure of seeing it firsthand, but everything I've read is just that it's this like magnificent beast. I wondered if you could speak about what is the Nile to you, and what were you what were you interested in bringing out about it through your writing?
The River Nile it's a defining characteristic of Sudan, but it's also, and I think it's something that exists on its own. So you have the country, and then you have the river. It exists by it because of the space that it takes up, not in just in geography, but in the whole context of the country. Its length and its width and its tributaries and the way it changes, the way it goes, it changes direction halfway, not halfway through, but somewhere near the north. You don't have many rivers that actually do that. And also because the role that it's played in from the beginning of time, people have been following the Nile in warfare, to invade other areas for transport. Of course, they've been using it for all these major communities live alongside the Nile because that's where they water their gardens, and that's where their livelihood is. And then all of these people are fighting over it. Who gets the water? How much water do they get? Who controls where the tributaries are? Who builds the dams? Who makes use of those dams? It just takes up so much of people's lives. But also because of its just, I find it as something that is so unpredictable, honestly. Again, because I didn't grow up in Sudan, I only went there for holidays, and then I lived there for medical school for 6 or 7 years, and then again I lived there when I started as a public health physician. So I've always seen it. Again, it's not something that I was used to. It's not something that I grew up seeing all the time. So it wasn't normal for me. It was always something strange, and seeing it in these different forms. So sometimes it's nice and calm, and you have the shimmering and the boats there and everything. And then next time, I remember once there was the rainy season and we were crossing a bridge. I used to cross a bridge to Khartoum to go to medical school. And this bridge is really high. And when you usually see the water, it's way down there. And then you have there are like farmlands on both sides, and there are these big barges there. And then once we were crossing, and I looked and I could see myself, I was looking into the dining room of the barge. It was literally stuck next to the bridge. The water was so high, it had lifted the whole thing up, and I was looking into the restaurant. And you were
Whoa.
a lot of water. This isn't some tiny river or some tiny pond. This is so much water that had just been flooding, and then it flooded both sides. And it was almost as high. It had almost reached the streets on both sides. And it was so brown and muddy because it was so turbulent. And this had just happened overnight. I was there the day before it hadn't happened, and then the next day I was looking into the restaurant, and that just gives you an idea of how this can change and how powerful it is. And it's just flowing along, and then it's like this. In some areas, it's like this. It's like a beast, as you mentioned, which is sleeping, and then suddenly it lifts its head and it opens its mouth and it just grabs someone from the side. So it doesn't matter if you. So that's like what I see is then it's this thing with a mind of its own. Obviously, it's just this such a powerful entity which can change its mind whenever it wants to, and you cannot tame it, and you cannot restrict it, and you can't shape it the way you want to. It's just going to do its own thing.
It's just so fascinating for me because I've lived almost all my life in London. So the only reference to a bigger river I have is the Thames. And I think sometimes I'm on the bank of the Thames. I'm like, oh, this is quite vast. But then when I read and I hear about the Nile, I'm like, oh my gosh, the Thames is like a puddle in comparison. So I think it's really important for us, I think, as well, to just think about also just like how like vast the world is, and the fact that our references are so minute compared to what is out there.
Yeah, yeah.
But Reem, it has been so lovely speaking to you. And just as we end, I wonder, what do you really hope for people that pick up your book?
First, I hope they enjoy it. They don't think. I always think that someone's going to read this and then they're going to be like, "Oh my god, what is this garbage?" So I hope they don't say that, and I hope that it. What I always want from my writing is that it makes people curious enough to look up something, either something specific that they read about or something about the country itself. And I'm hoping it's about the country. Um, so I do hope that this kind of opens their eyes and shows them Sudan as a place that is worth knowing about. Hopefully, again, that it makes them a little more interested in what's going on in Sudan at the moment, but just really about knowing what Sudan is and what it's like. Because really, a lot of people don't know. Actually, I don't know someone who does know. Everyone who reads my book is this is the first time we read something about Sudan. And I hope it might be the first thing, but not the last thing that they do to make people curious enough to want to know more. these other books that I'm writing. I hope so.
So can we expect more from you in the near future? What are your plans when it comes to writing now?
All my plans rely on me, like they say, waking up with a sense of motivation, which I don't have right now. I am writing. I'm writing a book that I was actually writing before this, and actually, my short story in relations is from this book. And this book is the first in a 2-book series, which mainly talks about the revolution, the popular revolution in Sudan, but also reaches back in time to look at where we started and how we got here. The revolution is the 2018 revolution, where people toppled the Islamist military regime, which has been in power for 30 years. And that was the first revolution I had attended. I wasn't there in person all the time, but it's something that we had witnessed on a day-to-day thing, and it was just seeing it from where it started and how it ended is something that has really inspired me to have a first draft, which is still not that complete, but hopefully by the end of the year, I hope, if I do ever get to writing, that it will be complete, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Because the first draft never has anything to do with the final draft, but at least just getting that first draft out is what's important.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely brilliant. And I wish you the world of luck with it. But I hope you believe in yourself as much as your readers believe in you, because honestly, A Mouthful of Salt was wonderful. Huge congratulations on getting out, because this is very recently published. So huge congratulations. And I completely understand that you don't feel like celebrating, but I hope you do absorb the goodness in some ways. But thank you so much for your time today, Reem. It has been so wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode with Reem, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.